You don't know the world you're living in.
Welcome to the future.
Welcome everybody, I'm the Gadfly, sent by God to rouse you into an examined life, and this week I want to offer you a few very insightful but difficult to wrestle with pieces of Stoic philosophy that I think have not aged a single moment in the past 2,000 years. Stoic philosophy is notorious for being a practical philosophy, which can be practiced in daily life and in a myriad of different scenarios. Ultimately, the Stoics thought that philosophy was the art of living and dying well, and they constructed their philosophy to help people live. This is far removed from the modern, academic, intellectually acrobatic philosophy we might see in universities or paper presentations at colloquia. As such, the wisdom they offer can make our lives better lived, despite having stumbled upon this wisdom thousands of years before you or I were ever born. That being said, let's get into it. The first Stoic idea I want to talk about is their notion of virtue. I think this is fundamental to everything else we're going to talk about, because to the Stoics, a good life is one lived in virtue, and virtue is sufficient for happiness. One of the major criticisms I hear in reference to this in the modern world is that many things make us happy that are not good for us, and will lead to a worse life for us. Obvious examples include the high and crash of using drugs, or the hedonistic pursuit of pleasure to the point of degradation. But the Stoics thought of virtue as more than simply doing the right thing when nobody's looking, or getting what you want because you are cunning and ambitious. To the Stoics, virtue is sufficient for a happy life because virtue keeps us in agreement with our nature. But this is not to say that the Stoics would shun technology and live only in the woods off of the land, but rather it's to say that the nature of man is one that functions well under certain circumstances and functions poorly under others. Human beings don't breathe well underwater, for example, so we should be at least wise enough to not try to resist that aspect of our nature, for example. But given that our nature functions well in some circumstances and functions poorly in others, the Stoics thought virtue would show us how to act in any given circumstance, such that we always function as well as possible. This is a notion called arete, or excellence, which is not unique to the Stoics, though they use it a bit different than other virtue ethicists, such as Aristotle. You can see why, then, practical wisdom is the primary Stoic virtue. Very simply, knowing the right thing to do, at the right time, in the right measure, is necessary in order to do, in practice, the right thing at the right time, in the right measure. At the same time, the Stoics would suggest that courage is exceptionally important, because knowing the right thing to do, but not having the heart to do it, or thinking you don't need to, will lead to problems that hinder a good life. The Stoics believed that trying to respond to life's problems without virtue will lead you astray down a path of desire, namely, to control that which is out of your control, thus dooming you to failure and suffering. Epictetus advises, if you see an attractive person, for example, you will find that self-restraint is the ability you have against desire. If you are in pain, you will find fortitude. If you hear unpleasant language, you'll find patience. And thus habituated, the appearances of things will not hurry you away along with them. I listed wisdom and courage, which the Stoics considered to be two of the primary four virtues, with the others being justice and moderation. Each virtue can be said to have sub-virtues within the broader category of the primary virtues, such as modesty or self-control or good discipline being sub-virtues of moderation, while honesty and fair dealing and piety are sub-virtues under the broad category of justice. In short, the Stoics thought virtue is sufficient for a good life because knowing the most beneficial thing to do, having the heart to do it, not being excessive or deficient in the action of carrying out the good deed, and being fair while delivering, is only going to bring about welcomed results. It's almost a tautology to say that if you know what will make you excel, and you are capable of doing that which will make you excel, then you will be excellent. Virtue, by definition, becomes synonymous with happiness. The second principle is almost a quotation. It's from Seneca's letter to Marcia, and it is, "You were never promised anything." Technically, this one is not a verbatim quote, yet it is short enough to recite several times a day as needed. Seneca says something very similar, though, more than once in this letter, and it's kind of the whole theme of the letter. As a Stoic, Seneca is attempting to convey the idea that fate will do things to us, whether we approve of those things or not. This is really just another manifestation of the larger Stoic idea that we have no control over anything other than our disposition. Sometimes what we want or desire coincides with what is going to happen, but that correlation does not justify, to a Stoic, having various wants and desires that are demonstrably out of our control. Stoicism is all about controlling one's life, but a Stoic believes this is done by controlling one's expectations and perspectives, not attempting to control destiny or fate. We set ourselves up for disappointment when we do not realize that what we expect or desire can fail, the Stoic believes, and this is no trivial matter. We set ourselves up for disappointment when we do not realize that we can get cancer. We set ourselves up for disappointment when we do not realize that our closest family members will die. We set ourselves up for disappointment when we expect to have a nice night on the town and not be violently attacked. Statements like, "We live in a civilized society," or "That should not be happening in the current year," or "Why did it happen to me?" all have the built-in assumption that you deserve better. But Seneca wants to point out that you don't deserve anything other than what is fated to occur. Now, if anybody has read deeper into the Stoics, you know that they're not defeatists, and they're not inactive, passive, depressed victims. Quite the opposite. They are emperors, statesmen, slaves, yes, sometimes, but also teachers, advisors, and political advocates. They are simply metaphysical realists who believe that many things happen in the universe independent of our preferences, and we can choose to get upset at them or not. A lot of training and various techniques are used by the Stoics to make this a livable philosophy, and I recommend William Irvine's A Guide to the Good Life as a great intro and easily accessible manual. However, the reason I like this quote is because it can be applied to anything in our daily lives. I find myself reciting this more times in a day than I can count. When I drop my phone and it cracks, I simply remind myself that I was never promised an unbroken screen when I woke up, but rather I was lucky enough to have it unbroken as long as it was. Or if I get yelled at by my boss at work, I remind myself that I was never promised a day without being scolded. I had just simply gotten used to such days. I was never promised anything. And this segues neatly into the third thing I would import from Stoicism into the modern world, which is their understanding of the relationship between man and his external pleasures. No clearer is this relationship expressed than in Seneca's 18th letter, in which he says, "I am not, mind you, against your possessing external goods, but I want to ensure that you possess them without tremors. And this you will only achieve in one way, by convincing yourself that you can have a happy life, even without them, and by always regarding them being on the point of vanishing." Seneca wants to say that we should always respect very earnestly the fact that whatever we have will at some point in the future be taken from us. Not that it could, or not that it might be, but that it will. Marcus Aurelius reiterates this numerous times in his Meditations to ensure us that whatever we have will be returned to where it came from, as will we. The Stoics in general want to point out that if we attach our happiness to things that we know will be taken from us, then our happiness will be taken all the same. Whether this is a loved one, or a child, or a cell phone, or a favorite t-shirt, Seneca wants us to remember that a time will come when we are not ready for these things to be taken from us, yet they will be taken nonetheless. Therefore, Seneca thinks, we should be happy with or without the things whose fate we do not control. Enjoy them while they're here, but know that they could be gone in an instant, and at some point they will. To put this into practice, The Stoics engaged in a sort of voluntary asceticism in which they would train the mind to be accustomed to loss and misfortune, the same way a weightlifter trains his muscles to bear heavy burdens. The letter from which this passage comes sees Seneca telling his friend to practice voluntary poverty, sleep on the floor rather than in his bed, eat much less and much more blandly than his normal diet, and even wear dirty and grimy clothing, because it is in times of security that the spirit should be preparing itself to deal with difficult times. While fortune is bestowing favors on it, then is the time for it to be strengthened against her rebuffs, Seneca advises. Furthermore, Seneca dedicates an entire paragraph to make clear that this suffering must be real and not an amusement. It does us no good to play poor while we are wealthy. We have to genuinely set in our mind the reality that we might starve, we might die, we might lose or be ridiculed, because Seneca says, "You will come to see that security from care is not dependent on fortune." This echoes Epictetus, who said, "Never say of anything, 'I have lost it,' but rather say, 'I have returned it.' While these things are given to you to possess, take care of them, but don't view them as your own." Ultimately, the Stoics want us to recognize that we control our response to things, not the things themselves. They want to teach us that our responses are often knee-jerk reactions, and as a result, we ought to train our responses in a very meticulous and almost militant way, so that our knee-jerk reactions become virtuous, since virtue is sufficient for happiness and human excellence. We excel when we are virtuous, and we become virtuous by habit, and we develop habit by training. Therefore, we ought to train the virtues so that we become habitually virtuous, and thus habitually happy and excellent at doing life. Thanks for watching. As always, like the video, comment in the comments section, and subscribe to the channel to stay notified on episodic releases.
They were men seen, neither that or everyone else's.